You are listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast, where we look to educate and entertain the endurance racing community through discussions with racing professionals and elite age groupers.
In today's episode, I speak with runner and coach Ian Sharman. We talk about some of his race highlights, including being in the top 10 8 times at Western States and winning the Leadville 100 3 times. We also talk about some valuable running tips that he gives us around training, racing, recovery, and injury prevention. I hope you enjoy. Ian, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
So let's start off with just learning a little bit about your background. I was reading up on you, and it said, you've got an economics background and worked for Deloitte for a while and then left to become a full-time coach. I too, I have a finance and business background. I worked for Deloitte a while back. I actually worked for Deloitte in London for a while, and I never have yet to be able to escape the cubicle. I'm still doing it after 20 plus years. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, how you kind of walked away from, I guess the ball and chain of corporate life and made that jump into full-time coaching.
Sure, yeah. It's the kind of thing I think I'd always dreamed of doing, which was to be able to work for myself. But I studied economics, and once I left university, everyone kind of gravitates towards London. That's where pretty much all the jobs are. And the most ambitious jobs, certainly, that's where you go. So that was when I was 22, 23. I was working in Deloitte for 7 years in London, did accounting stuff, and then I moved on to something called economic consulting, which used my degree combined with general finance stuff to do things like financial modeling, cost-benefit analysis. Anyway, no need to go too deep into that. But yeah, the kind of typical corporate job, loads of spreadsheets, that kind of thing. And then in 2006, I met my wife-to-be, who lived in Bend, Oregon. And I was actually via MySpace, which pretty much doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah.
And this was at the point where Facebook wasn't really out there. So MySpace was the whole social media thing was completely new, and it was just a way of chatting to random people around the world, and it was kind of interesting, and never thought it would be a good idea to start dating someone 5,000 miles away, but it kind of ended up like that. So from 2006 through to 2009, we did a long-distance relationship. I'd go over to Bend a lot, and I loved just how amazing everything to do with this town is, and that's where I live now. So, it just had mountains, it had trails, it had good restaurants, it had great pubs and breweries and things. So I kept, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, okay, well, what else can I do? I'm kind of bored of London now. I've been there long enough. So after 7 years, I moved over to the US and I got married in 2010. But we're still working for Deloitte because to come over here, it's much easier to get a work visa than a marriage visa, basically.
Yeah.
So I worked about a year in San Jose in the Bay Area in California. And then once I started getting some good ultra results, I was able to get some sponsors. So I started trying to work out what I could do that would allow me to do that more full time. So I wasn't enjoying the job down in San Jose. So as soon as my green card came through, I kind of left that, and it was conveniently at exactly the same time that I had a big win at Rocky Raccoon, a 100-miler back in 2011, where I got their course record there. So I thought, well, let's see what I can do. Maybe I can make a living out of running somehow. And I was getting people who were asking me if I coached them, just friends of mine back in the UK. So I thought, okay, well, let's give that a go. Let's see what's feasible there. So I made sure I did a lot of research, reading a whole load of books, getting qualifications like a certified personal trainer from the National Academy of Sports Medicine, also USATF coaching certification, just trying to learn everything I could, combine it with my own knowledge. And then I started my coaching business at that point.
Very cool. And so what was your running background like when you were still working? You obviously had a huge results. Like you said, you won that 100-miler. And, did you run growing up as a kid? I mean, how did that come about?
Not really, no. The reason I got into running was because I'd been living in London for a few years, and I'd always been very sporty and active. But I was just finding it was much more difficult to do that while you're doing a standard kind of corporate job, and London itself isn't as convenient for it. As a student and as a high school sports enthusiast, I was playing stuff all the time. And that was a lot harder to do when you have to get other people to be involved. I played soccer, I played tennis, cricket, rugby, squash, pretty much anything I could, field hockey, kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. But it was nice just being fit as a result of that. And I kind of should have known at that point that at the end of most of these games, I was the one running around the most. So there was an element of endurance there that just seemed to be built in
Yeah.
That meant that the deeper I got into any kind of sport within a certain game, the more advantage I'd have from that fitness and endurance. So it kind of makes sense that it ended up being running. But at the time, I thought running was really dull. So I never did it until I was about 24, 25, apart from the occasional kind of 100-meter race when I was much younger at high school. But it was, just kind of, it happened at exactly the right point that I saw a TV documentary. It was about a race in the Sahara Desert called the Marathon des Sables. And that's a 7-day stage race. Absolutely stunning visuals. I love travel, and I've always made sure that I do a lot of that. So I took a year off before university, for example. Took another few months after university, plus every summer holiday. So it just seemed like an epic thing to do, and it was an excuse to get in shape by entering this race. So I did that in 2006. So I started training for it about a year and a half before that, and just found I really enjoyed it. And that suddenly what started off as being a kind of 20 minutes was really boring doing running. Suddenly I could get to 3 hours and go, 3 hours feels fine.
Yeah.
And that was over the space of about a year for it to get like that. But I think that's what a lot of runners find, is that once you get into it, it's amazing how the question of boredom just doesn't even come up. And I think non-runners often think that running must be very boring because they have that same association that I had with it, that if there's no goal that you're running towards, well, what's the point of just running for the sake of running and so monotonous? But it really isn't, of course, once you get into it, and particularly if you do trails and you get to play in mountains and stuff like that, it's obviously very scenic and beautiful the whole time.
Yeah. So, talking about some of your running success, I wanted to switch gears and talk a bit about Western States. So, you've now had, after this, Western States just a few weeks ago, eight top 10 finishes there, and so that kind of consistency is incredible and really unheard of. So, talk a little bit about that. I mean, how do you have such consistency and success at this race, and obviously in ultras in general, but from a coaching perspective, what are some of the keys that allow you to do that?
Sure. I mean, I think part of that was that all the research I was doing in becoming a coach in the first place, plus all the trial and error that I did through all the racing I was running in the UK. I was running up to about 30 marathons a year at first, once I got quite addicted to it. And in London, that was fairly easy to do. I could go to all these different capital cities around Europe, and it would just be a 1 or 2 hour flight. I did a lot of weekends where I'd fly out of London early on Saturday, go straight to an expo, check in a hostel, get up early in the morning, run the marathon, and then get on a plane and go home. So not even taking any vacation to do it. So I definitely got a chance to really kind of not perfect things, but improve things over time through the practice I got through that. And there were occasional ultras in there as well, but it was much more about the kind of 26 to 50 mile distance for me at that point. And then once I got into 100 milers, I just looked at it in exactly the same way of how can I learn to do this better? And I realized very quickly that it was not just about physical fitness. There's all these other things that have a much bigger impact, whether it's keeping control of your stomach and not having that get queasy or not be able to eat or to be vomiting, dealing with heat, especially at Western States, and how it doesn't matter how fit you are, if you don't train for that and you don't deal with it well on race day, it can destroy your race. And often when one thing goes wrong, a whole load of other things start going wrong. So I kind of approached it with that analytical mind of coming from an economics background of, here are the variables. How do I do them as well as I can to get the best possible result from it? So that's exactly what I've done with coaching as well. I try and work out what are the strengths and weaknesses that any individual has, what does the race require, and how do we marry those strengths to fit in with it as well as possible and minimize the effect of any of those weaknesses by improving those elements of their running as well. So I think it's just because of that methodical approach that it's really helped in my own running. And because I talk about running all day long to different people who I'm coaching, it reinforces a lot of the messages that I'm trying to get across to them, that I can then stick to that better myself in a race. I think it improves my discipline and my tactics in a race because I'm constantly telling people things. And if I can't stick to it myself, how can I expect them to stick to any of the advice I give them? So I think that was it. It's not that I'm the fastest guy. I mean, there's loads of people way quicker than me who will have much higher VO2 maxes or have incredible times from track meets when they were younger or even recently, great 5,000 meter runners, 10,000 meter runners, marathoners. So I look at it as being, how do you get the most out of your body? You obviously want to get your fitness as high as possible, but especially for 100 milers, it's more important how close you can get to your actual fitness on the day than what that level of fitness is in the first place. And so that's kind of the thing that I focused on the most, is trying to have the perfect race. And it's an almost impossible thing to do in 100 miles, but I keep trying to learn every time. Each and every one of those Western states, I have things to take away from it. I know there was one thing in each of the last 3 years that wasn't ideal, and so I can different thing each time. I did at least learn not to make the same mistakes, but it means I take things away from each race to try and improve the next one.
Right. And so for this race that just happened, I mean, what was like the one or two things that you take away and say, I should have done that differently?
In this one, I felt like on the day, I pretty much got about as much as I could out of my body, which is always the aim. But I know that there was one mistake I made in the build-up, which was I had a race 3 weeks out that was one of these stage relays where you do 3 legs and it's kind of 24 hours long.
Right.
So you get the sleep deprivation. But I had 2 of the legs were very steep downhill legs because I like running downhills typically. But they kind of trashed my legs 3 weeks out from the race. And it was just a little bit much to be doing that then. I thought I could get away with it, but in hindsight, it meant that I just didn't really have any good runs between that race and Western States and just felt a little bit sluggish. So again, it was about optimizing how I actually felt on the day rather than how I hoped I'd feel. And I think that's one of the key things people often make mistakes with, whether they're a marathoner, a 5K runner, whatever it is. They have a goal of what they're trying to achieve, but they maybe stick to things too rigidly and say, I want to run a sub 24-hour silver buckle at Western States, for example. So if that's your aim, but then the conditions are much tougher than you expect, or you're dealing with problems you didn't think would happen, like you twist an ankle early on, or just the heat gets to you more, people don't necessarily adapt perfectly to how things are really going in the race, and they're still running the event of how their kind of dream race, how they expected it to go. And you've got to be able to adapt and roll with the punches, basically, that happen within a 100-miler. So that's what I always aim to do, and it's certainly not easy. I mean, it sounds much easier than it is in reality because there's so many things you have to deal with, especially in a longer race. But that was the one thing, just one race that was probably not ideal beforehand that didn't help. But ultimately, I was still able to get a top 10, which was my main aim there. But I'm still going to Western States every year, aiming to win it. I mean, I'm not there just to be an also-ran. Top 10 is important to me, but I want the win as well.
Right. And this year, obviously, the conditions were particularly interesting with a bunch of snow for the start. And then obviously you go from snowy conditions and then you get into the very extreme hot. So, how did you, either for yourself or athletes you're coaching, adjust the strategy to deal with the kind of sloppy conditions at the start of the race?
First of all, it was to get as much knowledge as possible about it. So I personally was up for a week before in Squaw Valley, and I was going up to that first section of the course. It starts off on a big hill that's about 4 miles long. So I was getting to see what the conditions were like, getting a sense of how the snow was feeling. And it was so hot that the snow was very soft and it was melting very quickly. But there's still so much of it because we had a big snow winter on the West Coast. So I then was telling the people I was coaching at the race, as well as myself, okay, well, we're going to have to factor this in. It means that the mountains are probably going to be a bit slower than normal. And that was exactly the case. I was about 20 minutes slower to the first aid station at 10.5 miles compared to the year before. So that's about 2 minutes a mile slower through to that first aid station, which is a huge change in pace. But it was the appropriate effort level. So instead of me thinking, okay, I've got to be at a similar time to last year to get to that aid station, I was thinking, I've got to just survive through this because it's going to be more effort and it's going to be slower. So I've got to make sure I don't ruin my race in the early stages. And that's so much about pacing and so much about adapting to the conditions that I try and really reinforce, especially in that final call that I have with someone before they take on a 100-miler, so that they can adapt as well. And it's difficult because we all have goals going into races, and sometimes you have to adjust those mid-race and still stay motivated. So whether that's about a finish time or a position, it's sometimes difficult to say to yourself, I've got to change what my goal is now. Otherwise, I'm not going to be motivated by that original goal because it doesn't look like it's going to happen. But often you'll find that because there's so many times where you go through low points in a 100-miler, sometimes because you're adapting and you have that willingness to change things and to deal with it, it often means that you get back on your original target again. So that was the biggest challenge early on, that things were just much harder and much slower. But then, as you said, it was also a super hot day, particularly hot from very early on. Even at the start line, it was much hotter than normal. And then through the mountains early on, it meant we had many more hours of dealing with heat. And then someone told me it was something like 111 or 113 Fahrenheit at the river crossing at mile 78.
Wow.
And the lead guys go through there at the hottest time of the day, and about 5 p.m. when the sun's at its worst, and it's very exposed there too. So that's, I think, probably the hottest I've ever experienced at Western States. Whenever they rank it year on year, they go by the high at the finish line in Auburn. And this wasn't one of the top few ones for that, but it looks like it could well have been one of, if not the hottest overall race, and for parts of the course where you're actually running in earlier stages where it's sunny. So that just slowed everyone down. You could see that from the men's and women's finish times were the slowest this decade. So everyone was slowed down by that. And the people who did well were the ones who adapted to it the best.
You or your athletes, when you're running this race, are you knowing that the conditions are going to be slow and messy at the beginning? Do you have splits you're looking at, or is it all by feel and relative to sort of what it is your overall plan is? And I could see there being a trap, and I think some people fell into that trap, which is they have splits, they push through no matter what the conditions were, and then they paid for it later. So how are you approaching that when you have something like this?
Well, I still have splits because I've done the race enough times. I know how long it's taken me to get to certain key parts of the race. So the mile 38 station is one of the key ones for me. Mile 62 at Forest Hill, the only town basically along the entire route. Down to the rivers at another time, and then the finish line, of course. So I have splits of what I'd like to be doing, but I'm not changing my effort level to fit in with that. I'm just using that as a good way to judge how things are going. So it's the same with Leadville that I run most years. I've done the last 4 years, where I know if my splits are good compared to previous years, but I'm not trying to aim for something specifically. So if I'm 2 minutes off my split from last year, I ask myself, okay, is that because I've taken it a little bit easier and maybe I'm in better shape at this stage because I haven't pushed as hard? Or am I pushing hard and I'm still struggling to stay anywhere close to last year's splits? And I would aim it to be just a benchmark as opposed to a target at each of these, each of the aid station splits. So I know roughly what I'm headed towards and how it's going to compare to previous years for myself and other people, but I'm not using that as the goal itself. Once it gets into the last maybe 20 or 30 miles, then I'll be really focused on that finish time. I'll be saying to myself, okay, just keep pushing. You can get under X number of hours. You can beat the time from whatever year you did it. Those kind of thoughts come into my head. But in the early stages, I just find that's not helpful at all to be worrying about what the splits are. But it's good to know what they are for a rough comparison, but not to react to that. So whether you're faster or slower than a split you're aiming for, even in a race where you've done it before and you can compare, it's still very difficult to do anything other than just use that as some information and then not react to it. And so that's what I always aim to do as well, just to say, okay, let's just keep doing what we're doing, keep looking after things, keep it steady and sustainable, which is the most important thing in a 100-miler. You never need to go that fast at any point. But it can be difficult to do that, especially this year when I'm seeing those early splits, and I know they're so much slower than I've ever done before at Western States. But then putting it in the context that it was the appropriate speed to be going at for how I felt and for my fitness level on the day. So it definitely does feel a little bit negative when that happens. But you say to yourself, well, everyone else is dealing with this too. It's not that I'm doing relatively worse. It's just that I'm doing what's appropriate for me right now. That takes, I think, a degree of confidence and discipline to stick to things that way. But it pays off in the latter stages and allows you to run much better when other people maybe have bonked or had things go really badly if they haven't done that kind of tactic.
Right. And so you mentioned Leadville, so I wanted to talk about that race a little bit. You're, I think, a 3-time champion there. It's obviously a well-known race and very challenging. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is the altitude where you start and where you race most of the day. So, I mean, from your perspective, coach's perspective, and obviously as an athlete who's had a ton of success there, I mean, how would you recommend, dealing with that altitude and, for someone who's not living at altitude and, how, should they get there a couple weeks early? What do you recommend from a training perspective to get ready for it?
Sure. I mean, that's certainly the biggest factor. So Western States, typically the biggest factor is the heat and how well you train for it and how well you deal with it. Leadville, it's very much the altitude. It starts at 10,200 feet in Leadville, goes up to 12,600 at the high point. So there's a lot of that can cause problems. You can get altitude sickness from about 8,000 feet upwards, and the entire course is above that. So if someone goes there and they don't live at altitude already, and they turn up a day or two before, they're typically going to have severe problems there that could even be enough to cause them to DNF, especially going over the high point of the course, which is you go over it just before halfway, and then because it's an out and back, you go on it right again on the way back. So for altitude adaptation, there's plenty of research on this, so we know the science behind it. We know that the body requires time at altitude to adapt. So it's very different to a lot of the other training stresses your body reacts to. So heat, for example, you just need to do little bits of stimulus a few times a week. So like an hour a day, 3 times a week for 2 to 3 weeks, and you'll get most of the adaptations. For altitude, there's no benefit to that. If you go up to the top of a mountain for an hour and do that every couple of days, you basically have zero adaptation from that because it's not enough of a stimulus to create enough red blood cells to help carry more of the oxygen or to help get access to that oxygen, given there's less of it you can get in any breath when you're at high altitude. So I would generally say that 2 to 3 weeks up at Leadville is ideal. That'll give you the vast majority of the adaptations you need. Longer than that, and it can start to be harder to train because being at high altitude, especially at 10,000 feet, it's very difficult to have much intensity. But that's a big commitment, say, going out for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So I would say at a minimum, people should go out for 1 week. If you're planning on doing a race like Leadville or Hard Rock, which is going on as we speak, also in Colorado, I'd say you've got to be planning on at least 1 week, by which I mean 7 days, not turn up at the end of the weekend and the race is the beginning of the next weekend. So that's a minimum. Otherwise, if you can't spare that much time, I'd say don't even try and do this race. These high altitude ones, you've got to give them enough respect. And there's a big difference between being at 10 to 12,000 feet or Hard Rock being up to 13, 14,000 feet regularly, and a race that's maybe at 6,000 or 7,000 feet where you feel the altitude a bit, but it doesn't have that much of an effect on the body, and it certainly doesn't cause sickness. It just slows everyone down marginally. And one thing people don't realize is that there's an exponential increase in difficulty the higher you go. So going from up to about 5,000 feet, there's almost no effect on the body. Then 5 to 6 is a little bit more. 6 to 7 is much more noticeable. And once you get way higher up, so 10,000 to 11,000 is a much bigger increase in difficulty for the body to cope with than, say, 5 to 6,000 feet. So it really does get significantly more difficult. And Hope Pass, the high point of the course, is the part that is most likely to make people either get ill and that could even just be as simple as the stomach getting much worse because your body's struggling to deal with that. But if you're there for at least a week, you're at least going to get some of the adaptations because the body, the way it reacts in terms of creating more red blood cells is that the first couple of days at altitude, you often feel a little bit worse, right? Because you haven't really adapted to it yet, but you've been at altitude, it just feels harder on the body. Then through the middle of that first week of being there, you're starting to notice it getting a little bit better, but you haven't really got to a better position until you're about 6 or 7 days in. And by that point, you've created some red blood cells and your body has adapted a little bit to it. So that's why every extra day above a week is really, really helpful. And I personally go up for 2 weeks before Leadville, and I wouldn't even try and do it if all I could do was turn up a couple of days before, because I know that there's no way that I could run it nearly to the best of my ability and probably couldn't even finish it, to be honest. Right. And I feel that I probably have better than average adaptation ability to altitude, which is more of a genetic thing than a fitness thing. But even still, if you just go up there from near sea level with very little time, then it's kind of a deal breaker that can ruin the race. Right. So the other thing to mention about this is, and I'm sure that is maybe your next question is, what about things like altitude tents and things that you can do at low altitude? And ultimately, these haven't been shown to have much of a benefit overall, and especially since it is the time at altitude that matters. So even if you're spending 8 hours a night in an altitude tent, that's not the majority of your day. You need to be just at altitude, somewhere like Leadville, somewhere high up for the race, for 24 hours a day. That's what's going to give you the biggest adaptation. Plus, altitude tents aren't quite simulating things quite in the same way, because they can change the air content, but they're not changing the pressure. Right. It's not quite the same effect on the body. But even if someone could spend, let's say, 12 hours a day in an altitude tent for a few weeks, I'd still say it's going to be much more pleasant and enjoyable just to go and play in the mountains and just say, let's take some vacation. Let's have 2 weeks up there, hike around in the mountains, take it nice and low intensity, but just get the body used to that altitude. And the other thing as well is that with most adaptations the body reacts to, so whether that's a speed session to improve your VO2 max, whether that's a heat training session to improve the amount of blood plasma you have, so that you can sweat more efficiently and your body adapts to heat better. Those things just take a stimulus of it being quite hard on the body and pushing it past its limit, and then you recover and the body adapts. Altitude, going hard when you're at altitude is not going to help you adapt quicker. And that, I think, is a mistake a lot of people make. They think if they do a hard effort at altitude, it's surely going to give them a bigger training stimulus. But the body doesn't react like that. You actually want to have a lower effort, because then your body is less tired and it's not having to waste energy on recovery from the run. And it's purely just putting the extra effort and energy into creating more red blood cells instead. So it's better to do low intensity wild altitude, which is another reason why about 3 weeks is the maximum you'd want to go up before a race. Because if you can't do much high intensity stuff in the last few weeks, You don't want to be out there for, say, 2 months and then just not be able to train that much while you're there, not have as much of a training stimulus on your general fitness as opposed to your altitude adaptation.
I've got another question on a different topic. So one of the things I get the most feedback on from listeners on this podcast is, hey, can you ask more questions around injury prevention and recovery? And obviously, from an injury prevention perspective, one good tactic would be to hire a coach that can help guide you and hold you back when necessary so you're not overtraining. But, what else would you kind of give for, people who are getting into the ultra distance sports? Obviously, you've had a lot of consistency and success. So, how would you go about giving them advice on, it's a big topic, so maybe just a couple things on prevention and recovery?
As you say, definitely a very big topic there. But one of the main things I'd say is don't think that because you're doing a longer distance in a race, you have to do way more mileage. Some of the best guys in the sport are kind of 60, 70 mile a week guys, which is not a small number, but it's not like a professional marathoner who might be doing 140 miles per week, so double the mileage. So that's one thing. Let's say you were doing 50 miles a week training for a marathon. That doesn't mean that you've got to ramp that up significantly to train for a longer distance. You've just got to make sure that your long runs are maybe a little bit longer. Things like back-to-back long runs are an important part of it. So that's one way to avoid overtraining. Another thing is being very flexible, and this is, as you said, where a coach can be useful because they're going to be an independent, objective third party to help you judge this, because most runners are a little bit type A, or a lot type A, to be honest, most of us. So it's important to have someone there who can put things in perspective and say, you do need to back off now, or we need to adjust your training plans. Don't just do that session for the sake of it because that's what we aim to do. Ask yourself, and does it feel appropriate today to do the training session that was planned? So whenever I go out the door, and this is exactly how I frame it for the people I'm coaching, always ask that one question of, what is the aim of today's run? And does it feel like you can achieve that? So it could even be weather conditions are different. So let's say it's a speed session, but it's 100 degrees outside, like it is in a lot of the country at the moment. So does it still make sense to do that speed session exactly as you planned, or will you just not be able to do it in those temperatures? And how, therefore, would you adapt either to maybe make that be on a treadmill, to change the session you do today to allow for the weather being different on another day, or just if you're noticing your body's a bit more tired than you expect, to back off and say, okay, today is going to be a recovery run, and we'll see how we feel tomorrow for that speed session. So that flexibility in where people have their different runs and just changing things on a day-to-day basis is a huge part of avoiding injuries. Another thing I'd say is foam rolling and massage are a really important part of avoiding things going wrong, because so many running injuries are due to the fact that it is a very repetitive motion that we're doing, especially someone who's running on a road, even opposed to a trail where at least it's a bit more uneven and each footstep's altered a little bit more. But because it's so repetitive, it does mean that there's a lot of muscle tightness that builds up, and many injuries are caused by the fact that tightness then alters the biomechanics, because the legs can't move or potentially the whole body can't move as freely as it wants to move, and therefore that constrains it and maybe puts a bit of strain in different areas. So you might have a sore left knee, but the problem is a tight right glute. Right. Unless you get rid of that tightness, it doesn't matter if you rest it'll go away when you rest, but then as soon as you run again, you've got the same cause and it'll just happen again. So that's where foam rolling and massage can have a really big role in just loosening things up, allowing you have to have the full range of motion in your legs, and also gives you a good sense of how your body's feeling. And that's another really important part of being able to stay uninjured, is knowing, is something feeling a little bit different? Is something feeling a bit off? And the more connected you are to how you normally feel and how you should feel, the easier it is to highlight something and make changes at the earliest possible stage before there's a more significant problem that then maybe takes you out for a longer period.
Right. And then from a recovery perspective, obviously I know staying active after a big event is probably the smart thing to do, obviously not with a lot of impact. And I was reading somewhere you said, and I don't know how long ago it was, so I don't know if you still subscribe to it, that doing weighted hiking is a good low impact way to enhance recovery. Is that something you still recommend? Can you just talk about that? Because I haven't really thought of that before, and it sounds great.
I do that a lot. Yeah, so it's when I use a weight vest, I'm not trying to run with it. So it's not that I'm doing some kind of like army training thing to learn to run with a backpack and have 50 pounds on my back. The way that I incorporate weight vests in training is to have it at a slightly lower weight. So mine, for example, is 20 pounds, which you can feel a little bit of effort, but it's not that significant. And the size of the person is going to affect how heavy you want that to be. So a 100-pound woman probably wouldn't want a 20-pound pack within this context of how to use weight vests. But then I also don't do up the zipper or the clasps at the front so that it swings a little bit. So it's working on core strength, but in a very small way. And then I only do small amounts of hiking, so just a couple of miles with hills that aren't too steep. So I live on a hill that's about 500 feet, so I got 1 mile, 500 feet up and right back down again. I'm just doing that at an effort level and for a short enough amount of time that it doesn't feel too hard on the body, and it's a lot less pounding on the legs than if I do a recovery run even. So it's kind of fulfilling several different things. One of them is that it's lower intensity, doesn't have much pounding on the muscle, so it allows you to get some active recovery, just getting the blood pumping around. It's also building up in a small, regular way, a little bit of extra strength, but not in a particularly hard way. It's not like you're going to feel achy afterwards like you would after maybe doing a big heavy weight session in the gym on your legs. So it just combines active recovery with a bit of strength work and a bit of core work in a very sustainable way. And so it's good for both recovering after a big event. It's good for building up to a big event as well. So I did a lot of weight-based hiking before going out to Western States. I'll do a good chunk of it before I go out to Leadville as well, because it's a very good way of just building up that strength and making your legs a little bit more solid for downhills in particular, but also it's improving your ability to hike, which is an important part of 100 milers. So it has so many benefits there. But again, flexibility is the key thing. If you've done a particularly hard training session and your legs are a little bit dead, maybe it doesn't make sense to do it with as much weight, or maybe you make it a shorter distance, or you just do something to make it even easier on the body. Maybe do a walk without a weight vest, for example, on a day like that. But that kind of flexibility makes a world of difference so that you actually get the benefit of what you're trying to do rather than sticking to something a little bit too anally and then it actually is being detrimental and it's not achieving the aim that you initially wanted from it.
Right. Well, that's really good advice. It's something I'm going to incorporate. I haven't actually thought about that. And I do some weighted, like treadmill, steep incline work, that kind of stuff. But I never really thought of it from a recovery perspective. So I'm going to add that to my list of tools. It's really, really interesting.
So, as I was saying, in terms of make sure you know what the purpose of any session is as you go out the door. So with that, it's active recovery is your main aim. So if it doesn't feel like recovery, if it feels quite hard or your legs are really sore, then it probably isn't the appropriate thing to do at that point, because then it's doing something different to what you're aiming for with it. So that degree of flexibility is very important.
Right. So Ian, we're almost out of time here. I want to end with one final question. So you've given us so many good tips and advice. And so for someone who you obviously you have a coaching business, you have a bunch of coaches that work with your business, and just can you talk briefly about that and like what services you offer and how one can go about looking into that?
Sure. Yeah. So I've over the last 2 years I've expanded to have a few other coaches, and they're all well-known, well-respected, intelligent ultra runners. I've got Ellie Greenwood, multiple, winner of pretty much every race out there. Isa Howard, Magda Boulet, the Olympian, who was just second at Western States a few weeks ago. Sean Meissner and Zach Bitter, who holds the American record for 100 miles. So they're all people who've achieved a lot themselves and have been coaching for a number of years and really know what they're talking about. And the idea is that they each have slightly different skill sets. So because all of us combined can talk to each other, we can ask questions and we can learn from each other, it allows us to have kind of slightly different specialisms. So Zach, for example, is really good if someone wants to do a track race or a flatter ultra. He's got a bit more of a bias towards that in terms of his knowledge. Ellie's particularly good at things like comrades in South Africa, which she's won. So by us all having slightly different areas that we've excelled in ourselves, we can have a bit more knowledge than any one person could have on their own. So it makes us stronger as a team. So we offer online coaching. We don't do anything in person. But we actually, at the moment, have people in 6 continents around the world. So the only continent we don't have a client in at the moment is Antarctica. And we do that all through Skype and phone calls and email and an online training plan, and just adjusting things and again, flexibility being a big part of it, so that we're getting to know the clients as well as possible, getting to know their needs and how we need to adjust things, and having ongoing conversations with them all the time so that we know exactly how things are going for them and how we need to adjust their training to hit the goals that they're aiming for.
So Ian, thank you so much for your time today. I learned a ton, so I'm really, this has been a great conversation. So I'm definitely going to put some of this to work and, appreciate your time.
Thank you. And I suppose I should just say, if you want to find me as well, it's Sharman Ultra is the name of the company, and it's sharmanultra.com. So that's my last name, SHARMAN ultra.com.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put that on the blog as well. I'll put that link on there.
Thanks for listening to the Intelligent Racer podcast. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit www.intelligentracer.com. Also, be sure to check us out on social media and please review us on your podcast directory. Join us next time for another edition of the Intelligent Racer.